Thank you, and thank you, Brent and Dan, for allowing me the venue to come here and make this presentation. The whole genesis of this is my sabbatical work of last spring, and I got to say that I'm probably a product of the modern industrial food system. I loved my mother, but she was no cook, and so, you know, one of the regular meals that she would make, she would take a roast and put it in the oven and cut up carrots and potatoes and onions, and you know, that was sort of the extent of her cooking, and that kind of morphed into she would take the roast, and I don't know where she got this idea, but she would pour a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup over it, and then a packet of dried Lipton French onion soup, and this would make what I recall to be a very tasty gravy. You know, mashed potatoes, mashed by hand, gave way to mashed potato flakes. There was also Spam that she fried up in the frying pan. Kraft macaroni and cheese, and then there was also eating out at Elsie's Fish and Chips. But like I say, I love my mother. She actually put her energies into housekeeping, and her house was one of those houses where you could eat off the floor, but you know, do you want to eat Spam and macaroni and cheese off the floor? I guess it's so anyway. The food system, the modern industrial food system is, you know, and I think a lot of you probably have heard a lot of these things already about the food system, and you know, some of the problems that are generated by it. I mean, we've got a 30% obesity rate in this country. We've got the Census Bureau reports that 16% of families that with households with children are food insecure. You know, we've got E. coli outbreaks. We've had mad cow disease. We've got, oh geez, you name it. Got any number of problems produced by this industrial food system. And so you may know the problems, you're probably knowing the problems, but what does Jurgen Habermas have to do about this? Well, I think he provides a way to understand all of this stuff, and hopefully what I'll do is present the theory in a way that's explanatory and doesn't oversimplify it, yet provide some insight into how to understand this food system. There are a couple of paper handouts up here if you want to have a paper handout. Here's the electronic version. So how many of you are familiar with Michael Pollan? Pollan? Oh, okay. So he's been everywhere. I mean, he's featured in Food Incorporated. He's written any number of books, and his book In Defense of Food was really the thing that sort of where the light went on and said, wait, Jurgen Habermas is talking about the same thing. So in his book In Defense of Food, he has these food rules, and he actually spun that off into a book in and of itself, and those three, I just wrote down three of them here. Don't eat anything your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Well, he says great-grandmother, so it's dependent on how old you are. He uses the example of Go-Gurt, right? You know, if you presented your grandmother or great-grandmother with Go-Gurt, she wouldn't know whether it was food or toothpaste. And so that's one rule. Another rule, don't get fuel for your body the same place you get fuel for your car. You know, and so, you know, mini-marts, nothing good can come out of food that you get from a gas station mini-mart. Another rule, and this was one of the ones that really was the trigger for me was we've got a lot of problems with our food system, but we ought not to look for a magic bullet. And so he says that what has happened to us is that we have fallen into this thing called nutritionism. And the subtitle of his book, In Defense of Food, is Eat Food, Not as Much, Mostly Plants. And so the first part of that is eat food. And he says that what we've done is we've focused on nutrition and the nutrients in the food. So we're concerned about eating low fat or low carb or getting our correct amount of omega-3 fatty acids or whatever the nutrient of the day happens to be. And Pollan's suggestion is that his food rule is that we should eat food and we should get away from that nutritionism and we should get back to eating whole foods, raw foods. And so what does Jurgen Habermas have to do about this? Who was Habermas? A couple of you I know Habermas. Let's have a show of hands. Okay, so you can correct me if I stray from his theory. Habermas was a German critical theorist, and critical theory arose in the post-World War II era, and their general sort of raison d'etre was to sort of answer the question why there hadn't been a proletarian revolution, and how could German fascism had arisen in the post-World War I Germany. And so what Habermas does is really maddening and amazing at the same time. He pulls everyone together, all of the major theorists of sociology and linguistics and psychology. And so he combines Max Weber and Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, and others into this grand theory. And what he wants to do is he wants to not relinquish the goal of the Enlightenment project. And so he wants to believe that we can make a better world and make a better world for all of us. And so his theory is aimed at that. And he begins with Weberian rationality. And there are a couple different meanings of this term rationality. And one of them is this idea of practical rationality or praxis. And this dates back to Aristotle and beyond, probably. And the question is, how do we live a good life? How do we make a life that is good for all of us? And what he says is that, Bill McKibben I've got here, and a lot of people are questioning whether or not our current economic, political, social system is giving the good life for all of us. Bill McKibben, for one, questions whether economic growth is providing a good life for all of us. And maybe in this focus for economic growth, we're losing sight of some things that aren't measured by economic growth. And he's one of a number of people who have questioned our current sort of social accounting system for the good life. So Habermas is concerned with systems. And so the idea here, he says, I skipped a bullet point, Habermas's contention is that our life world has been mediatized, technicized, and colonized. And I'll get to each of those in turn. But what he means is that these three processes of mediatization, technicization, colonization have undermined this quest for living a good life. And it certainly relates to the food system. So systems have undermined the life world. This is one of the fundamental things that Habermas says. So what is the life world? The life world for Habermas is the world of communication. It's the communication that we do amongst ourselves, that we share in creating our world and understanding our world. And he's saying that this social life world is being undermined by social systems. In particular, the social system of the economy and the social system of the administrative system. So you could put that in simple terms: our life has been undermined by money and power. But what he means by systems and media is that as society gets more complex, more diversified, more differentiated, we don't have the ability to plan the way we're going to live, to adjudicate people who step outside of the norms by simply getting together as a community and discussing it. So administrative systems have crept up in the form of governments, administrative bureaucracies, economies that provide this function. And what happens is these qualitative verbal communication that we have gets translated into these media of dollars and votes. So communication is a qualitative thing. It's verbal. Administrative and economic decisions are quantitative. So you get a bill passed in Congress by getting the necessary votes. You write an administrative rule by having yes or no decisions about whether someone qualifies for a program. Price in dollars determines what products get on the marketplace. And so that's a simplified example of this idea that systems overrun community, communication, and this thing he calls the life world. And I'll give a couple examples along the way that hopefully make this clear. One example is there's currently a drought in Texas, and there was a drought in Texas in, let's see, when was it? The late 1990s, I believe. And so the government came up with a support bill to support farmers who were suffering from this drought. And one of the things, again, to dip back into the theory, in parentheses it says steering action. And what that means is that Marx said long ago that the economic system is prone to crises, and we're in one now. And we had one that reached its height in 2008, 2009. And what happens is the administration, the government, takes action to mitigate these crises, to, in essence, save capitalism. Because if we didn't have unemployment insurance, if we didn't have bank bailouts, if we didn't have GM getting bailed out, we'd fall into an economic crisis that would undo capitalism. And so the administration, the government, engages in these things called steering actions. And this happened when the government created this program to mitigate the losses of farmers in Texas. And so what happened was the program got altered through money and power, money and votes, The program got altered so that recipients didn't actually have to be victims of drought, but the program was changed so that any crisis determined by the government would allow farmers to collect these support payments. And this occurred through the familiar process of campaign finance, donations, money, dollars, buying votes, and congresspeople altering legislation to meet the needs and wants of moneyed constituents. And so what happens, the upshot of this is, in 2003, the shuttle Columbia broke up as it was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and some of that debris landed in East Texas. Well, what happened was, this was designated, administratively designated, as a crisis that would warrant the tripping of price supports. And so farmers who were sought out by USDA farm extension agents and given these payments, and some of the farmers didn't even know why they were getting the payments. Well, I think it had something to do with the shuttle crash. Even though they didn't suffer any damage from the falling debris, they still collected the payments for it. So is this administrating a program because of need, or is it administrating a program because of administrative rules and that were brought about by changing the rules to serve moneyed interests? And Habermas calls this juridification. So we're not as much concerned with the end product as we are following the rules that are shaped by moneyed interests. So let me move on to technology here. Our life world has become technicized. And so one of the things that is part of this rationality that Weber talks about is that we're in a quest for efficiency. And what Weber said was that he called it the irrationality of rationality. And so part of this idea of becoming rational in the technical sense of the word is to use technology to make our food system more efficient. And so we have an efficient food system. We have food that's produced by fewer farmers than ever before. We have an abundance of food now that's on the market. But are we achieving the good life? We've got any number of these diseases of the West: obesity, diabetes, heart disease. Are we producing a food system that is serving the needs of all people? And we're not, clearly. And technology is part of that. We have, in our quest for efficiency, we've created CAFOs, concentrated animal feedlot operations, where we have thousands of chickens together, housed in one place, thousands of cows, thousands of pigs. And that produces economies of scale. It produces chickens more quickly, lowering the price of chicken. But what we do in the process to cover up all the flaws of housing thousands of chickens in one place is feed them antibiotics. We feed them hormones to make them bigger. So we have a chicken that comes to market in 48 days rather than 3 months. And so it's efficient in the sense of being rational, but it's causing all these side effects that are not good. And part of this technicization is, to go back to Pollan, is we rely on food scientists to tell us what's good to eat, rather than using a social communicative process to do it. So what I do remember from growing up is I remember my mother telling me how to pick a cantaloupe that's ripe, and you smell it. That was her technique, and you smell it, and if it smells cantaloupe-y, then it's ripe. And so this is the idea of a life world, a communicative act of passing on knowledge about food, and it's embodied in culture. Cultures have particular things that they eat, that come from their particular region, that are prepared in a particular way, and those things are getting undermined by the social systems of the food industry. So we rely on nutrition scientists rather than our mothers to tell us what's good to eat. I'm of Polish heritage, and so I wanted to make pierogi. My grandmother was long since passed away, so what did I do? I went to the internet, of course, and so rather than learn how to cook through this communicative act of sharing, I learned through a recipe that I got on the internet, and so there's technology replacing communication. So the colonization of the life world. Here's where we come back to Marx, and one of the problems with this food system is that it treats food as a commodity. It treats food as something to be bought and sold, and so the social acts of buying and selling get reduced to the simple, or the social acts of producing and consuming food get reduced to buying and selling. And read a book recently by Julie Guthman called Agrarian Dreams, where she talks about organic agriculture, and her text really is a great example of this idea of colonization. The organic movement started out as a movement. It started out as a group of like-minded people who were trying to make change in the way we eat and the way we farm. And so they had any number of goals that were qualitative goals. They wanted to change the process of farming, and they wanted to institute things like planting cover crops, composting, crop rotation, all with the goal of creating a sustainable soil. They wanted to reverse industrial farming to create a nutrient-rich soil. They also had other goals in mind as well. They had goals of local production of food. They had goals of social justice for farm laborers. All of these are things that I would call qualitative. They wanted to make these qualitative changes to the way we eat and the way we produced food. And so they embraced organic farming. And in the beginning, there was a community of these organic farmers that shared information. They didn't abandon science, but they shared their own knowledge, their own inquiry in a communicative community of organic farmers. And what happened along the way was the idea that organic becomes a brand. It becomes a commodity. It becomes something, a label that you can apply to food to make it sell better, to get a price premium, right? So organic food sells for more than the non-organic food. And so large farmers entered this organic market in order to gain the profit that was to be had from the organic label or organic brand. And so what happens is the qualitative goal of replenishing the soil and all of those other goals that the organic movement had get quantified in creating organic standards. So we have to create standards that say this is organic and this isn't. And what that got turned into was lists of things that were allowable and inputs into the soil that were allowable and non-allowable. And that occurred through a political process. Administrative agencies were created to monitor and enforce those standards. And what happened along the way was that the standards got distorted by large industrial growers. And so things were qualified as or labeled as natural because they came from the soil. So one of the examples that she uses is sodium nitrate. Sodium nitrate is natural, it comes from the soil, but it doesn't, when added as a fertilizer to a crop, it doesn't reach that goal of replenishing the soil as the movement organic farmers had intended. And so one of the points that Guthman makes in her book is that this whole quest toward agroecology got shifted and distorted along the way because of the administrative creation of the definition of what organic is, as well as the moneyed interest of big farmers who had an interest in making organic a brand to be sold and to make a profit from. And this, I think, is what Habermas is talking about when he talks about colonization. A social community getting overrun by administration and economic demands. So this whole discussion, for me, begs the question of, can we come up with a definition of praxis? Can we come up with a definition of goals that meet everyone's interest? And I think that's very difficult. What do we want from our food? Well, right now we have cheap food and we have a lot of it. And you could debate the quality question, certainly with the E. coli outbreaks and all of that, you could bring that into question. But you could bring in health and safety issues, sustainability. You know, what do we want from our food system? And is there a good life that we can all agree upon? And so, you know, in the whole discussions of CAFOs with community activists who are saying, this is not good for us, it's polluting the water, it's polluting the air, it's killing fish by the thousands, it's disrupting our community. You know, the answer of these big industrial farmers was that you have to get big to make money, and this is, you know, and this is how we do it. And so clearly their interests are not in the general interest. And so, you know, so I think it's a real question whether, I think everyone wants good food and everyone wants safe food. I think probably people can agree upon that. But issues of price and sustainability are things that maybe are not so universal across the population. So the last thing that Habermas talks about is crises. And one of his early books was called Legitimation Crisis. And it raises the question of, you know, can we make change? And there are a lot of sprouts shooting up, if you want to use the food metaphor. You know, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture. Michael Pollan's books are selling. They're on the New York Times bestseller list. You know, community gardens. You know, so people are making, I mean, that's a recognition on the part of a lot of people that our food system is in trouble. And people are seeking alternatives. But will those alternatives bring a change in the system? And I got to say, I'm not hopeful. You know, I mentioned steering actions, and in 2008, 2009, we had an economic crisis that threatened to bring down the entire global financial system. You know, we had huge banks that were failing, and the actions of the Bush and Obama administrations can certainly be seen as steering actions, propping up that financial system and keeping that same system in place. There was some protest, and even lately there have been some protests on Wall Street, but it seemed to me that if that kind of a crisis that is threatening people with, you know, with foreclosure, putting people out on the street, decimating people's pensions funds. My wife's in particular, she would retire if this financial crisis hadn't dipped into her TIAA CREF. But with all of that widespread crisis and recognition that, in fact, a lot of people are benefiting at the expense of the rest of us, if that didn't prompt some sort of a change in the system, then it doesn't make me hopeful for people's recognition of the flaws in the food system overturning it. And in the end, we've still got food being sold as a commodity, whether it's at a CSA or at a farmer's market. And so I'm not hopeful. And one last thing that Habermas talks about motivational crises, and essentially what he's saying is that we've been bought off by consumption and leisure, that we have a degree of consumption and we have a degree of leisure that makes us comfortable and makes us less apt to call the system into question and bring about fundamental change. So that is the conclusion, and now that I've confused you all with Jurgen Habermas, I'll open things up to questions or comments. Yeah, Molly. Yeah, no, I, I agree, although I would say that food and money are both fundamental, but yeah, and food is something that we can change on an individual basis, and I guess my question is whether those individual changes will bring about systemic changes, you know. I mean, they're certainly worthwhile. I mean, you can eat more healthily if you know, and even industrial organic, Pollan concludes, is in the main better for us because we are, you know, consuming fewer chemicals and it's better. So, you know, I don't want to discard those. Rich. I didn't think there was going to be a test on that. Well, actually, Guthman's book was one of the things I got out of the geography course I sat in on, and so if nothing else, I got that. But you know, one of the things that that the original organic farmers wanted to do was go back to localism, and the idea that you know, that foods are local to their geographic area, and that and we do ourselves a disservice by, you know, shipping in strawberries from Mexico in February, and that whole process, you know, creates a food system that's not as healthy for us. So yeah, geography matters, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, Mickey. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. And I think when we're getting this gathering of people together to discuss our common interests, you know, are the poor going to have the equal seat at the table to be able to convey their interests? And I, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure that forum could be created. But you're absolutely right that you know, bad food costs less. You know, you get more calories per dollar out of processed foods than you do from whole foods, and so it's more economically rational for poor people to eat less good because they get more calories per their dollar. So it's definitely a problem. Yeah, yeah, Michelle. Yeah, yeah, and the other thing people have pointed out, in addition to doing a whole nutritional analysis, is, you know,
the price of food does not accurately measure the costs of agriculture. It doesn't measure soil degradation. It doesn't measure water pollution. It doesn't measure the health costs of fighting the diseases of the West. And so that's part of the problem with using price and dollars as a measure. Other questions, comments? Gary?
Well, it just occurs to me, though, in spite of what you're saying, that the capitalist system is remarkably responsive to market pressure, and that niche markets will pop up, like the farmer's market down there.
Mm-hmm.
And if enough consumers make choices, then the industry should follow. But it involves people being educated to what their actual needs are.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the stuff we're talking about. Because it seems to me if we wanted purple bacon, the stores would supply it.
Yeah.
If we want real organic food locally grown,
Mm-hmm.
the stores will supply
Yeah.
it. We don't need governmental systems because
Mm-hmm.
the capitalist system itself
Yeah.
is responsible.
And there are examples in the positive of just that sort of thing. I remember, I forget when it was. McDonald's used to put its burgers in styrofoam boxes, and there was an outcry, and there was public pressure on McDonald's, and they're now using box board and paper for their sandwiches. Similarly, there was pressure put on McDonald's to, they're one of the largest buyers of eggs in the country and chickens, and so pressure was put on them to only buy chickens that have slightly more humane conditions, right? And so, pressure can be brought to bear, but will that change the fact that food is a commodity, and will that commodity nature of food always distort the kind of food we get?
But what's the option short of us all becoming subsistence farmers to not somehow procuring food from those who supply it? The question is what kind of structure do you do that in? Do you do it in a face-to-face market with the farmer?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you do it through the intermediaries of the
Yeah.
middle people?
That's the question. That is, a huge question. Yeah, it's all fine and good that we have small farmers, we have small organic farms, but will they be able to feed the world? And what will the structure of agriculture look like? I don't pretend to have any answer. I will say, though, that one of the comments that people have made about small farms, community farms, local farmers markets, is that it does give people a chance to interact face-to-face with the people who are producing their food. And so it brings that sort of life world element of social interaction, qualitative communication. You can ask, what pesticides did you use? And ask those kind of questions. But no, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but it's a good question. I don't know. And the people who support and defend industrial agriculture say that local small farms are just inadequate to meet our food needs. So, okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming.